Okay, Robinson Crusoe, Chapter 6. This chapter is not quite as long as Chapter 5 was, but it's still pretty lengthy. So we'll get right into it, except for a brief reminder that the previous chapter, we saw Robinson writing in his journal. He covered his full first year on the island. However, we will see now that he is beginning to run out of ink. A little after this, my ink began to fail me, and so I contented myself to use it more sparingly and to write down only the most remarkable events of my life, without continuing a daily memorandum of other things. I made a little discovery which was of use to me afterwards. As soon as the rains were over and the weather began to settle, which was about the month of November, I made a visit up the country to my bower, where though I had not been some months, yet I found all things just as I left them. The circle or double hedge that I had made was not only firm and entire, but the stakes which I had cut out of some trees that grew thereabouts were all shot out and grown with long branches, as much as a willow tree usually shoots the first year after lopping its head. So the stakes that he has used to make the fence in his summer residence, his vacation home, have grown new shoots and are kind of becoming this natural leafy fence or wall. As much as a willow tree usually shoots the first year after lopping its head, I could not tell what tree to call it that these stakes were cut from. I was surprised and yet very pleased to see the young trees grow, and I pruned them and led them up to grow as much alike as I could, and it is scarce credible how beautiful a figure they grew into in 3 years. So that though the hedge made a circle of about 25 yards in diameter, yet the trees, for such I might now call them, soon covered it, and it was a complete shade, sufficient to lodge under all the dry season. This made me resolve to cut some more stakes, and make me a hedge like this in a semicircle round my wall. I mean that of my first dwelling, which I did, and placing the trees or stakes in a double row at about 8 yards distance from my first fence, they grew presently, and were at first a fine cover to my habitation, and afterwards served for a defense also, as I shall observe in its order. Some foreshadowing. So he's cut some stakes from the fence that he built in his summer residence has grown into new plant life, and so he's cut some of those same stakes, some of those same trees, and he's planted them around his original wall of his original dwelling so that they too will grow and provide shelter and also additional defense. So his original dwelling now has several layers of defense. When it rained, I found much employment, and very suitable also to the time, for there were many things which I had no way to furnish myself with, but by hard labor and constant application. Particularly, I tried many ways to make myself a basket, but all the twigs I could get for the purpose proved so brittle that they would do nothing. It proved of excellent advantage to me now that when I was a boy, I used to take great delight in standing at a basket maker's in the town where my father lived to see them make their wickerware, and being, as boys usually are, very officious to help, and a great observer of the manner how they worked those things, and sometimes lending a hand, I had by this means full knowledge of the methods of it, so that I wanted nothing but the materials. Basically, he's saying because he knows how to make baskets, but he doesn't have the materials to do so. When it came into my mind that the twigs of that tree from whence I cut my stakes that grew might possibly be as tough as the sallows and willows and osiers in England, and I resolved to try. Accordingly, the next day I went to my country house. I'm going to go back and reread that. When it came into my mind that the twigs of that tree from whence I cut my stakes that grew might possibly be as tough as the sallows and willows and osiers in England, and I resolved to try. Accordingly, the next day I went to my country house, as I called it, and cutting some of the smaller twigs, I found them to my purpose as much as I could desire. Whereupon I came the next time prepared with a hatchet to cut down a quantity, which I soon found, for there was a great plenty of them. These I set up to dry within my circle or hedge, and when they were fit for use, I carried them to my cave, and here during the next season I employed myself in making, as well as I could, a great many baskets, both to carry earth, or to carry or lay up anything I had occasions. And though I did not finish them very handsomely, yet I made them sufficiently serviceable for my purpose. And thus afterwards I took care never to be without them, and as my wickerware decayed, I made more. Especially I made strong, deep baskets to place my corn in, instead of sacks, when I should come to have any quantity of it. Having mastered the difficulty and employed a world of time about it, I bestirred myself to see, if possible, how to supply two wants. I had no vessels to hold anything that was liquid, except 2 runlets, which were almost full of rum, and some glass bottles, some of the common size, and others which were case bottles, square, for the holding of spirits, of waters, spirits, etc. I had not so much as a pot to boil anything, except a great kettle, which I saved out of the ship, and which was too big for such use as I desired it, to make broth and stew and a bit of meat by itself. To make broth and stew a bit of meat by itself. The next thing I would fain have had was a tobacco pipe, but it was impossible to make one. So he obviously knows enough about the use of tobacco to be familiar with smoking it from a pipe. I employed myself in planting my 2nd rows of stakes, and in this wicker working all the summer or dry season, when another business took me up more time than it could be imagined I could spare. I mentioned before that I had a great mind to see the whole island, and that I had travelled up the brook, and so on to where I built my bower, and where I had an opening quite to the sea on the other side of the island. I now resolved to travel quite across to the seashore on that side, so taking my gun, a hatchet, and a larger quantity of powder and shot than usual, with 2 biscuit cakes and a great bunch of raisins in my pouch for my store, I began my journey. When I had passed the vale where my bower stood, I came within view of the sea to the west, and it being a very clear day, I fairly descried land. Whether an island or a continent I could not tell, but it lay very high, extending from the west to the west-southwest at a very great distance. By my guess, it could not be less than 15 or 20 leagues off. So 15 leagues is about 83 kilometers, and 20 leagues is about 111 kilometers. So he spotted another piece of land in the distance. I could not tell what part of the world this might be, otherwise than that I knew it must be part of America, and as I concluded by all my observations, must be near the Spanish dominions, and perhaps was all inhabited by savages, where if I should have landed, I had been in a worse condition than I was now, and therefore I acquiesced in the dispositions of Providence, which I began now to own and to believe ordered everything for the best. So he's beginning to have greater faith in Providence, which means in God. I say I quieted my mind with this and left afflicting myself with fruitless wishes of being there. So he's thankful that he is where he is now, because he assumes that if he was on that other piece of land that he saw, that he would be in greater danger. Besides, after some pause upon this affair, I considered that if this land was the Spanish coast, I should certainly, one time or other, see some vessel pass or repass one way or other. But if not, then it was the savage coast between the Spanish coast and Brazil's, which are indeed the worst of savages, for they are cannibals, or men-eaters, and fail not to murder and devour all the human bodies that fall into their hands. With these considerations, I walked leisurely forward. I found that side of the island where I now was much pleasanter than mine, the open or savanna fields sweet, adorned with flowers and grass, and full of very fine woods. I saw abundance of parrots, and fain I would have caught one, if possible, to have kept it to be tame and taught it to speak to me. I did, after some pains taking, catch a young parrot, for I knocked it down with a stick, and having recovered it, I brought it home. But it was some years before I could make him speak. However, at last I taught him to call me by my name very familiarly. That's a hard word to say. very familiarly. I was exceedingly diverted with this journey. I found in the low ground hares, as I thought them to be, and foxes, but they differed greatly from all the other kinds I had met with, nor could I satisfy myself to eat them, though I killed several. But I had no want of food, and of that which was very good too, especially goats, pigeons, turtles or tortoises, and grapes. I never traveled in this journey above 2 miles outright in a day or thereabouts, but I took so many turns and returns to see what discoveries I could make that I came weary enough to the place where I resolved to spend the night. And then I either reposed myself in a tree or surrounded myself with a row of stakes or set upright in the ground, either from one tree to another, or so as no wild creature could come at me without waking me. I'll reread part of that. And then I either reposed myself in a tree or surrounded myself with a row of stakes set upright in the ground, either from one tree to another, or so as no wild creature could come at me without waking me. As soon as I came to the seashore, I was surprised to see that I had taken up my lot on the worst side of the island, for here the shore was covered with innumerable turtles, where on the other side I had found but 3 in a year and a half. Here also an infinite number of fowls of many kinds, some of which I had seen and some which I had not seen before, and many of them very good meat, but such as I knew not the names of, except those called penguins. I could have shot as many as I pleased, but was very sparing of my powder and shot, and therefore had more mind to kill a she-goat if I could, which I could better feed on, and though there were many goats here, more than on my side of the island, yet it was with much more difficulty that I could come near them, the country being flat and even, and they saw me much sooner than when I was on the hill. I confess this side of the country was much pleasanter than mine, but yet I had not found... I confess this side of the country was much pleasanter than mine, but yet I had not the least inclination to remove, for as I was fixed in my habitation, it became natural to me, and I seemed all the while I was here to be as it were upon a journey, and from home. However, I travelled along the shore of the sea towards the east, I suppose about 12 miles, and then setting up a great pole upon the shore for a mark, I concluded I would go home again, and that the next journey I took should be on the other side of the island, east from my dwelling, and so round till I came to my post again. I took another way to come back than that I went, thinking I could easily keep all the island so much in my view that I could not miss finding my first dwelling by viewing the country. But I found myself mistaken, for being come about 2 or 3 miles, I found myself descended into a very large valley, but so surrounded with hills, and those hills covered with wood, that I could not see which was my way by any direction but that of the sun, nor even then, unless I knew very well the position of the sun at that time of the day. It happened to my farther misfortune that the weather proved hazy for 3 or 4 days while I was in this valley, and not being able to see the sun, I wandered about very uncomfortably, and at last was obliged to find out the seaside, look for my post, and come back the same way I went, and then by easy journeys I turned homeward, the weather being exceeding hot, and my gun, ammunition, hatchet, and other things very heavy. In this journey I surprised a young kid, and saved it alive. I had a great mind to bring it home if I could, for I had often been musing whether it might not be possible to get a kid or two, and so raise a breed of tame goats, which might supply me when my powder and shot should be all spent. I made a collar to this little creature, and with a string which I made of some rope yarn, which I always carried about me, I led him along, though with some difficulty, till I came to my bower, and there I enclosed him and left him, for I was very impatient to be at home, from whence I had been absent above a month. I cannot express what a satisfaction it was to me to come into my old hutch and lie down in my hammock bed. This little wandering journey without settled place of abode had been so unpleasant to me that my own house, as I called it to myself, was a perfect settlement to me compared to that, and it rendered everything about me so comfortable that I resolved I would never go a great way from it again, well, it should be my lot to stay on the island. I reposed myself here a week to rest after my long journey, during which most of the time was taken up in the weighty affair of making a cage for my Paul. So that's the parrot that he has previously captured. Making a cage for my Paul, who began now to be thoroughly domesticated and to be mighty well acquainted with me. Then I began to think of the poor kid which I had penned in within my little circle, and resolved to go and fetch it home or give it some food. Accordingly I went and found it where I left it, for indeed it could not get out, but almost starved for want of food. He's not the nicest owner of pets. I went and cut boughs of trees and branches of such shrubs as I could find, and threw it over, and having fed it, I tied it as I did before to lead it away. But it was so tame with being hungry that I had no need to have tied it, for it followed me like a dog, and so I continually fed it. The creature became so loving, so gentle, and so fond that it would never leave me afterwards. The rainy season of the autumnal equinox was now come, and I kept the 30th of September in the same solemn manner as before, so another year has passed. Coffee today, not juice. I kept the 30th of September in the same solemn manner as before, being the anniversary of my landing on the island, having now been there 2 years, and no more prospect of being delivered than the first day I came there. It was now that I began sensibly to feel how much more happy this life I now led was, with all its miserable circumstances, than the wicked, cursed, abominable life I led all the past part of my days. Remember, he was wayward, he didn't listen to his father, he didn't follow God, he just did whatever it was his own inclination, and he took advantage of a lot of people. It was now that I began sensibly to feel how much more happy this life I now led was, with all its miserable circumstances, than the wicked, cursed, abominable life I led all the past part of my days. And now I changed both my sorrows and my joys. My very desires altered, and my delights were perfectly new from what they were at my first coming, or indeed for the 2 years past. Before, as I walked about, either on my hunting or for viewing the country, the anguish of my soul at my condition would break out upon me on a sudden, and my very heart would die within me, to think of the woods, the mountains, the deserts I was in, and how I was a prisoner, locked up with the eternal bars and bolts of the ocean, in an uninhabited wilderness, without redemption. In the midst of the greatest composures of my mind, this would break out upon me like a storm, and make me wring my hands and weep like a child. Sometimes it would take me in the middle of my work, and I would immediately sit down and sigh and look upon the ground for an hour or two together. And this was still worse to me, for if I could burst out into tears or vent myself by words, it would go off, and the grief, having exhausted itself, would abate. But now I began to conclude in my mind that it was possible for me to be more happy in this forsaken, solitary condition than it was probable I should ever have been in any other particular state in the world. And with this thought, I gave thanks to God for bringing me to this place. Thus, and in this disposition of mind, I began my 3rd year. And though I have not given the reader the trouble of so particular an account of my works this year as the first, yet in general it may be observed that I was very seldom idle, but having regularly divided my time according to the several daily employments that were before me, such as, first, my duty to God, and the reading of the Scriptures, which I constantly set apart some time for thrice every day. Secondly, the going abroad with my gun for food, which generally took up 3 hours in every morning when it did not rain. Thirdly, the ordering, curing, preserving, and cooking what I had killed or caught for my supply. These took up a great part of the day. Also, it is to be considered that in the middle of the day, when the sun was in the zenith, the violence of the heat was too great to stir out, so that about 4 hours in the evening was all the time I could be supposed to work in, with this exception, that sometimes I changed my hours of hunting and working, and went to work in the morning and abroad with my gun in the afternoon. To this short time allowed for labor, I desire may be added To this short time allowed for labor, I desire may be added the exceeding laboriousness of my work, the many hours which, for want of tools, want of help, and want of skill, everything I did took up out of my time. For example, I was full 42 days making me a board for a long shelf, which I wanted in my cave, whereas 2 sawyers with their tools and a saw pit would have cut 6 of them out the same tree in half a day. Likewise, caring for my corn took a great deal of time, for I had to contrive ways of preventing both beasts and fowl from eating it. For the beasts, I surrounded my arable land with a hedge. For the fowl, I discovered that if I shot some and hung them up for a scarecrow, the other birds would not come near. Then I had no plow to turn up the earth, no spade or shovel to dig it. Well, this I conquered by making a wooden spade, as I observed before. But this did my work in but a wooden manner, and though it cost me a great many days to make it, yet for want of iron it not only wore out the sooner, but made my work the harder, and made it be performed much worse. However, this I bore with, and was content to work it out with patience, and bear with the badness of performance. When the corn was sown, I had no harrow, but was forced to go over it myself, and drag a great heavy bough of a tree over it, to scratch it, as it may be called, rather than rake or harrow it. When it was growing and grown, there were many things I wanted: to fence it, secure it, mow or reap it, cure and carry it home, thrash, part it from the chaff, and save it. Then I wanted a mill to grind it, sieve to dress it, yeast and salt to make it into bread, and an oven to bake it, and yet all these things I did without, as shall be observed. And yet the corn was an inestimable comfort and advantage to me too. All this, as I said, made everything laborious and tedious to me, but that there was no help for it, neither was my time so much lost to me, because as I had divided it, a certain part of it was every day appointed to these works. And as I resolved to use none of the corn for bread till I had the greater quantity by me, I had the next 6 months to apply myself wholly by labor and invention to furnish myself with utensils proper for the performing all the operations necessary for the making the corn, when I had it, fit for my use. Thus I discovered, after many miserable failures, how to make pots and plates out of clay, and how to fire them until they could serve as cooking utensils. I made myself a pestle and mortar out of the same ironwood with which I had fashioned my spade. My next difficulty was to make a sieve, and here I was at a loss, until I remembered I had among the clothes which were saved out of the ship some neckcloths of calico or muslin, and with some pieces of these I made 3 small sieves, but proper enough for the work. The baking part was the next thing to be considered, and how I should make bread when I came to have corn, for at first I had no yeast. As to that part, as there was no supplying the want, so I did not concern myself much about it. But for an oven I was indeed in great pain. At length I found out an experiment for that also, which was this. I made some earthen vessels, very broad but not deep, that is to say about 2 foot in diameter, and not above 9 inches deep. These I burnt in the fire as I had done the other, and laid them by, and when I wanted to bake, I made a great fire upon my hearth, which I had paved with some square tiles of my own making and burning also, but I should not call them square. They're probably misshapen. When the firewood was burnt pretty much into embers or live coals, I drew them forward upon this hearth, so as to cover it all over, and there I let them lie till the hearth was very hot. Then sweeping away all the embers, I set down my loaf or loaves, and turning the earthen pot upside down upon them, drew the embers all around the outside of the pot to keep in and add to the heat. And thus, as well as in the best oven in the world, I baked my barley loaves, and became in little time a complete pastry cook into the bargain. For I made myself several cakes of the rice and puddings. Indeed, I made no pies, neither had I anything to put into them, supposing I had, except the flesh either of fowls or goats. I guess he doesn't have vegetables. It need not be wondered at if all these things took me up most part of the 3rd year of my abode here, for it is to be observed that in the intervals of these things I had my new harvest and husbandry to manage, for I reaped my corn in its season, and carried it home as well as I could, and laid it up in the ear in my large baskets, till I had time to rub it out, for I had no flour to thrash it on. No floor to thrash it on, or instruments to thrash it with. And now indeed, my stock of corn increasing, I really wanted to build my barns bigger. Now, if you recall, when he's talking about corn, at least from what I've managed to find, he means barley. So corn is just another word to him for barley. And sometimes he uses barley and sometimes he uses corn. And now indeed, my stock of corn increasing, I really wanted to build my barns bigger. I wanted a place to lay it up in, for the increase of the corn now yielded me so much that I had of the barley about 20 bushels, and of the rice as much, or more, insomuch that I now resolved to begin to use it freely, for my bread had been quite gone a great while. Also I resolved to see what quantity would be sufficient for me a whole year, and to sow but once a year. Upon the whole, I found that the 40 bushels of barley and rice was much more than I could consume in a year. So I resolved to sow just the same quantity every year that I sowed the last, in hopes that such a quantity would fully provide me with bread, etc. All the while these things were doing, you may be sure my thoughts ran many times upon the prospect of land which I had seen from the other side of the island, and I was not without secret wishes that I were on shore there, fancying seeing the mainland, and in an inhabited country I might find some way or other to convey myself farther, and perhaps at last find some means of escape. But all this while I made no allowance for the dangers of such a condition, and how I might fall into the hands of savages, and perhaps such as I might have reason to think far worse than the lions and tigers of Africa, that if I once came into their power, I should run a hazard more than 1,000 to 1 of being killed, and perhaps of being eaten. For I had heard that the people of the Caribbean coast were cannibals or man-eaters, and I knew by the latitude that I could not be far off from that shore. Even supposing they were not cannibals, yet they might kill me, as many Europeans who had fallen into their hands had been served, even when they had been 10 or 20 together. Much more I that was but one, and could make little or no defense. All these things I say, which I ought to have considered well, and did cast up in my thoughts afterwards, yet took up none of my apprehensions at first, but my head run mightily upon the thought of getting over to the shore. Then I thought I would go and look at our ship's boat, which, as I have said, was blown up upon the shore a great way in the storm when we were first cast away. She lay almost where she did at first, but not quite, and was turned by the force of the waves and the winds almost bottom upwards against a high ridge of beachy rough sand, but no water about her as before. If I had had hands to have refitted her and to have launched her into the water, the boat would have done well enough, and I might have gone back into the Brazils with her easily enough. But I might have foreseen that I could no more turn her and set her upright upon her bottoms than I could remove the island. However, I went to the woods and cut levers and rollers and brought them to the boat, resolved to try what I could do, suggesting to myself that if I could but turn her down, I might easily repair the damage she had received, and she would be a very good boat, and I might go to sea in her very easily. I spared no pains, indeed, in this piece of fruitless toil, and spent, I think, 3 or 4 weeks about it. At last, finding it impossible to heave it up with my little strength, I fell to digging away the sand to undermine it, and so to make it fall down, setting pieces of wood to thrust and guide it right in the fall. But when I had done this, I was unable to stir it up again, or to get under it, much less to move it forward towards the water, so I was forced to give it over. And yet, though I gave over the hopes of the boat, my desire to venture over for the main increased, rather than decreased, as the means for it seemed impossible. In the middle of this work, I finished my 4th year in this place, and kept my anniversary with the same devotion and with as much comfort as ever before. I had now brought my state of life to be much easier in itself than it was at first, and much easier to my mind as well as to my body. I frequently sat down to my meat with thankfulness and admired the hand of God's providence, which had thus spread my table in the wilderness. I learned to look more upon the bright side of my condition and less upon the dark side, and to consider what I enjoyed rather than what I wanted. And this gave me sometimes such secret comforts that I cannot express them, in which I take notice of here, to put those discontented people in mind of it, who cannot enjoy comfortably what God has given them, because they see and covet something that he has not given them. All our discontents about what we want appeared to me to spring from the want of thankfulness for what we have. That's a good point to remember. Sometimes when we forget to be thankful for the many things we do have, we end up being so focused on what we don't have that we are discontented and discouraged and live a much less happy life as a result of our lack of gratitude. I had now been here so long that many things which I brought on shore for my help were either quite gone or very much wasted and near spent. Going back to the gratitude thing, the Bible commends us that in everything we should give thanks. And it's God's will that we thank him, because no matter our circumstances, we have so much to be thankful to God for salvation, for Christ, for the gift of eternal life, for the chance to experience the world no matter what our life is like. Our life is still a gift, and we are all precious, all made in God's image. I had now been here so long that many things which I brought on shore for my help were either quite gone or very much wasted and near spent. My ink, as I observed, had been gone some time, all but a very little, which I eked out with water a little, till it was so pale it scarce left any appearance of black upon the paper. As long as it lasted, I made use of it to minute down the days of the month on which any remarkable thing happened to me. The next thing to my inks being wasted was that of my bread, the biscuit which I brought out of the ship. This I had husbanded to the last degree, allowing myself but one cake of bread a day for above a year, and yet I was quite without bread for a near year before I got any corn of my own, and a great reason I had to be thankful that I had any at all, the getting it being, as has been already observed, next to miraculous. My clothes began to decay too, mightily. I saved the skins of all the animal creatures that I killed, 4-footed ones, and hung them up, stretched out with... Okay, another drink. Page 101. My clothes began to decay too, mightily. I saved the skins of all the creatures that I killed, 4-footed ones, and I hung them up, stretched out with sticks in the sun, by which means some of them were so dry and hard that they were fit for little, but others, it seems, were very useful. The first thing I made of these was a great cap for my head, with the hair on the outside to shoot off the rain, and thus I performed so well that after this I made me a suit of clothes wholly of these skins, that is to say, a waistcoat and breeches breeches open at knees, and both loose, for they were rather wanting to keep me cool than to keep me warm. I must not omit to acknowledge that they were wretchedly made, for if I was a bad carpenter, I was a worse tailor. However, they were such as I made very good shift with, and when I was abroad, if it happened to rain, the hair of my waistcoat and the cap being outermost, I was kept very dry. After this, I spent a great deal of time and pains to make me an umbrella. I was indeed in great want of one, and had a great mind to make one. I had seen them made in the Brazils, where they are very useful in the great heats which are there, and I felt the heats every jot as great here, and greater too, being nearer the equator. Besides, as I was obliged to be much abroad, it was a most useful thing to me, as well as for the rains as the heats. I took a world of pains at it, and was a great while before I could make anything likely to hold. Nay, after I thought I had hit the way, I spoiled 2 or 3 before I made one to my mind. But at last I made one that answered indifferently well. So indifferently well means well enough. The main difficulty I found was to make it to let down. I could make it to spread. He could open it, but he couldn't. But if it did not let down to and draw in, it was not portable for me anyway, but just over my head, which would not do. However, at last, as I said, I made one to answer and covered it with skins, the hair upwards, so that it cast off the rains and kept off the sun so effectually that I could walk out in the hottest of weather with greater advantage than I could before in the coolest, and when I had no need of it, could close it and carry it under my arm. Thus I lived mighty comfortably, my mind being entirely composed by resigning to the will of God and throwing myself wholly upon the disposal of his providence. This made my life better than sociable, for when I began to regret the want of conversation, I would ask myself whether thus conversing mutually with my own thoughts, and as I hope I may say, with even God himself, was not better than the utmost enjoyment of human society in the world. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 6. We will start chapter 7 next. We see that Robinson Crusoe has now been on the island for 4 years, that he has become accustomed to his way of life, that he has made himself fairly comfortable. He has learned a lot of new skills, and he has also learned to put his trust in God.